or else a Joe RMBA by H. Tristio Delt, Te Moment Fro Siemens. The unexpected departure. Dr. Alexander Petrov sat comfortably on his sister's plush sofa, afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows as they shared tea and conversation. At 58, with silver threading through his dark hair, he cut an impressive figure, a distinguished quantum physicist, whose papers on subatomic particle behavior had earned him respect throughout the scientific community. This visit was meant to be a brief respite from his demanding research schedule, just a few hours of familial warmth before returning to his calculations and experiments. Elena Matthews listened attentively as her brother described his latest project, her medical training allowing her to understand the implications of his work better than most. 23 years as a cardiologist had sharpened her analytical mind, though nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for what would happen next. The quantum tunneling effect we've observed suggests particles can traverse barriers previously thought impenetrable. Alexander explained, gesturing enthusiastically with his teacup. It challenges everything we understand about. His words terminated abruptly as a violent cough interrupted him mid-sentence. The teacup tumbled from his hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. Alexander's face contorted in pain as he clutched his chest, eyes wide with sudden terror. The silent interval. Elena watched in horror as her brother's body went completely still. No sound escaped his lips, no movement disturbed his frame. His head slowly tilted backward, settling against the sofa cushion as though he had simply fallen asleep. But the medical professional in Elena recognized the terrible truth immediately. This was no slumber. She leaped to his side, medical instincts overriding familial panic. Her trembling fingers found no pulse at his neck, detected no breath from his parted lips. Alexander Petrov, brilliant mind and beloved brother, had slipped into sudden cardiac arrest without warning. "Alexander, can you hear me?" she called, lowering him to the floor with practiced efficiency. Tears blurred her vision as she initiated CPR, compressing his chest in the precise rhythm that had saved countless patients throughout her career. But this was different. This was her brother, her only remaining family. 8 minutes, 8 agonizing minutes that stretched into eternity. Each second a battle against the inevitable. Each compression a desperate plea to whatever forces might be listening. Elena, who had always maintained professional composure in medical emergencies, found herself whispering prayers she hadn't uttered since childhood. The unexpected return. The first faint intake of breath was so slight that Elena nearly missed it, focused as she was on the mechanical precision of resuscitation. Then came another, stronger, more deliberate. Alexander's eyelids fluttered, then opened fully, revealing eyes that somehow seemed different, deeper, as though they had witnessed something beyond ordinary experience. Elena couldn't believe it. After 8 minutes without oxygen, without signs of life, her brother had returned. Medical training told her this was extraordinary. Clinical experience warned of likely brain damage. But nothing prepared her for what Alexander whispered next, his voice barely audible but unnervingly clear. "This isn't the end, Elena. There's life there too, but it's completely different. So much better." Those words froze her in place, stethoscope still pressed against his chest. The steady heartbeat beneath her fingers confirmed he was alive, but the certainty in his voice suggested he had been somewhere else entirely during those 8 minutes, somewhere that had fundamentally changed him. Alexander Petrov, renowned physicist, dedicated atheist, a man who had built his entire worldview on empirical evidence and mathematical precision, had just shattered his own paradigm with 15 simple words. Paritephycist's paradigm is a life built on logic. Prior to that fateful afternoon, Alexander Petrov's perspective had been uncompromisingly materialistic. With 3 published books on quantum mechanics and dozens of peer-reviewed papers, he had established himself as a leading voice in scientific rationalism. In university lectures, he often dismissed spiritual experiences as neurochemical illusions and described consciousness as merely an emergent property of complex neural networks. His sister had once asked if his rigid materialism left room for anything beyond the physical world. Alexander had responded with characteristic certainty. "Everything must have a formula, Elena. Everything must have a logical explanation. When people speak of souls or afterlives, they're simply creating comforting fictions to avoid confronting the finality of death." This wasn't mere academic posturing. Alexander genuinely believed that the universe operated according to discoverable principles and nothing more. He had devoted 4 decades to uncovering those principles, designing experiments that probed the very fabric of reality while dismissing anything that couldn't be measured or quantified. Even during occasional philosophical discussions with colleagues, Alexander maintained that consciousness itself would eventually be fully explained through neuroscience and computational models. The mind was the brain, nothing more. 8 minutes in the unknown now, Recovering in his sister's guest bedroom, Alexander struggled to reconcile his lifelong convictions with what he had experienced during those 8 minutes of clinical death. The experience defied all his previous understanding. It hadn't felt like unconsciousness or the disorganized hallucinations one might expect from an oxygen-deprived brain. I didn't simply black out, he explained to Alina, who listened with a mixture of professional interest and personal concern. I awoke somewhere else without pain, without weight, without a body. I couldn't feel my limbs. Yet, I was more present, more aware than I've ever been in physical form. He described floating effortlessly, as though the very air supported him. Around him stretched a profound silence, not empty, but filled with meaning. Light surrounded him without any visible source, and space extended infinitely in all directions. He traveled through what felt like a tunnel. Yet it wasn't frightening. It felt strangely familiar, as though he had traversed it before, perhaps in dreams or in some forgotten ancestral memory. The most extraordinary aspect was thought itself. Alexander continued, his eyes bright with wonder. The boundary between thinking and reality had dissolved completely. The power of consciousness in this extraordinary state, Alexander discovered that thought possessed tangible power. When he imagined moving in a particular direction, he moved. When he visualized an object, it appeared before him with remarkable clarity, not just as a visual representation, but as a complete understanding. I thought about that old television in my apartment, the one that stopped working years ago, he told Lena. Suddenly, I could see its entire history, from the mining of ore for its components to the assembly line where it was manufactured. I could see the worker who had soldered one particular connection incorrectly, causing the eventual malfunction. Alina remained skeptical, attributing such detailed visions to his brain's attempt to create coherent narratives during trauma. But when Alexander returned home 3 days later and opened the television's casing, he found and repaired exactly the fault he had seen during his experience. The television worked perfectly afterward. This validation shook him profoundly. If his consciousness could access such specific information during clinical death, what did that suggest about the nature of mind itself? Was consciousness truly confined to the brain, as he had always insisted, or was it something more expansive that merely interfaced with physical reality through neural networks? The presence beyond, perhaps the most transformative aspect of Alexander's experience, was the realization that he wasn't alone in that boundless realm. At first, he thought he was simply thinking aloud, carrying on an internal dialogue. But gradually, he recognized that the responses to his questions weren't coming from within his own mind, they originated elsewhere, carrying wisdom deeper and more comprehensive than anything he had ever encountered. There was something there with me, he explained to Alina, struggling to find adequate words. Not a figure or entity in any physical sense, but a presence warm, powerful, all-encompassing. It felt like the breath of the universe itself, gentle yet omnipotent. This presence conveyed understanding and compassion of a quality Alexander had never experienced, even among his closest human relationships. It didn't control him, but rather guided him like a parent gently leading a child through unfamiliar territory, ensuring he wouldn't become frightened by the vastness of what he was experiencing. It wasn't God as religions describe, Alexander clarified, knowing his sister would wonder. It was something more fundamental, more primal, a field of consciousness from which individuality emerges and eventually returns. I sensed that my separate identity was both real and illusory simultaneously. Parahurld by from patterns of reality in this formless realm, Alexander's scientific mind continued to analyze and observe, though the tools of analysis had transformed entirely. No longer constrained by mathematical formulas or physical laws as he understood them, he perceived reality as interconnected patterns of meaning and relationship. Everything responded to consciousness, he explained. I'd focus my attention and I would move. I'd imagine an object and it would appear not as a physical form but as a complete understanding of its essence and purpose. There was no separation between observer and observed, between knowing and being. Alexander described how he could perceive multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. When he contemplated any subject, he instantly understood its past, present, and future trajectory, not as separate time frames, but as a unified continuum of possibilities. The arbitrary divisions between past, present, and future dissolved, revealing time itself as another construct of consciousness rather than an absolute dimension. In that state, I understood that what we call physical laws are really just the habits of consciousness, operating at the collective level, he said. Or beliefs about what's possible quite literally shape what becomes possible. The universe isn't a machine running on predetermined rules. It's a responsive expression of consciousness itself. The interconnected web. As Alexander adjusted to this extraordinary state of awareness, he began to perceive connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, causal relationships invisible to ordinary perception, but blindingly obvious from his expanded perspective. What had appeared random or coincidental throughout his life now revealed itself as part of an exquisite, intentional pattern. I could see how every decision, every interaction ripples outward, affecting countless other beings and events. He told Lena, the butterfly effect isn't just a poetic metaphor, it's the literal structure of reality. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is connected to everything else in ways our linear minds can barely comprehend. From this vantage point, Alexander recognized himself as both an individual consciousness and an integral part of something vastly greater. The artificial boundaries between self and other dissolved, revealing a unity underlying all apparent separation. He felt simultaneously infinitesimal and infinite, a paradox that made perfect sense within this expanded state of awareness. I recognized this wasn't an illusion or hallucination, Alexander insisted. It felt more real than anything I've ever experienced, as though ordinary reality is the shadow and this was substance. The clarity, the certainty, the comprehensive understanding far exceeded anything my physical brain could produce. The reluctant return. Alexander couldn't determine how long he remained in this boundless state. Time as he knew it had ceased to exist, replaced by an eternal present filled with meaning and awareness. He felt completely at home, as though he had arrived at a destination he had unconsciously sought his entire life. There was no fear, no pain, no loneliness, he recalled. Only clarity, lightness, and an indescribable sense of belonging. I wanted to remain there forever. But just as he began to fully embrace this new reality, Alexander felt the space around him beginning to contract. The boundless expanse started to compress and accelerate, twisting like a scroll being rapidly wound. He sensed himself being pulled back, not invited or requested, but forcibly extracted from this expanded state of being. I resisted, Alexander admitted, his voice breaking slightly at the memory. I fought against the return. I begged to stay where everything made sense, where everything was connected and meaningful. But something was pulling me back with irresistible force, like a carrot being yanked from the earth. The light and energy that had surrounded him began to dissipate. Consciousness contracted, sensations narrowed, and limitations reasserted themselves as he felt himself being dragged back toward his physical form. The painful awakening, when Alexander opened his eyes to see his sister's face pale with fear, eyes wide with desperate hope. His first emotion wasn't relief but profound disappointment. Her voice reached him as though from a great distance, filled with trembling joy. You're here! You're alive! But inwardly, Alexander was thinking something entirely different. Why did you bring me back? It was so beautiful there. The contrast between the limitless awareness he had just experienced and the confining limitations of physical existence was initially devastating. Returning to his body felt like being stuffed into a tight, restrictive container after soaring freely through infinite space. The weight of physical form, the narrow bandwidth of sensory perception, the linear constraints of time all felt unexpectedly burdensome. Yet even as these sensations settled around him, Alexander recognized that something profound had transferred back with him. The experience hadn't simply ended with his revival. It had implanted something permanent within his consciousness, a perspective that would transform every aspect of his remaining life. He had experienced clinical death. He had ventured beyond the threshold that separates worlds. But the most important realization came not during the experience itself but afterward, as he integrated what he had learned into his understanding of existence. Per ivta tsoen, the skeptic reborn. Before his near-death experience, Dr. Alexander Petrov had been the embodiment of scientific skepticism. He hadn't merely questioned the existence of non-physical reality, he had actively dismissed it, considering spiritual experiences as nothing more than the brain's misinterpretation of neurological events. Soul, God, afterlife, these were simply comforting myths invented by humans to cope with the terror of mortality. His professional life had been dedicated to the measurable, the quantifiable, working with advanced theoretical physics and precise calculations. He had helped design systems that launched satellites into orbit. In his worldview, there was no place for mysticism or transcendent experience. But his return from clinical death changed everything, not because he suddenly wanted to believe, but because he now knew firsthand. He had experienced a realm that felt more authentic than physical reality itself, and he could no longer pretend otherwise, even if maintaining his previous worldview would have been professionally expedient. The certainty is what's most difficult to convey, he explained to a colleague who questioned his dramatic shift in perspective. It wasn't faith or belief, it was direct experience, more vivid and coherent than anything I've known in ordinary consciousness. Sharing the unspeakable, despite knowing he risked his professional reputation, Alexander began speaking openly about his experience. He accepted invitations to scientific conferences where, instead of presenting his latest research on quantum mechanics, he described the realm he had visited during clinical death. He spoke about the power of thought, the infinity of consciousness, and how 8 minutes had taught him more than 4 decades of scientific inquiry. Many colleagues reacted with predictable skepticism. Some suggested he had experienced complex hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation. Others proposed that his brain had fabricated a comforting narrative to protect itself from the trauma of impending death. A few openly ridicule him, dismissing his account as evidence of emotional breakdown or incipient mental illness. But Alexander noticed something striking about these interactions. While his critics could offer theoretical explanations for what he had experienced, none could account for the certainty he felt. They were arguing against something they hadn't experienced, while he was simply bearing witness to what he had directly perceived. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he would respond calmly. "I'm simply reporting what I experienced, just as a physicist reports experimental observations. You can interpret those observations however you choose." The scientific breakthrough, the most remarkable consequence of Alexander's experience, came unexpectedly. For 2 years before his cardiac arrest, his research team had struggled with a complex problem involving guided missile systems. The mathematics were proving intractable, the engineering challenges seemingly insurmountable. Multiple approaches had failed, and funding was in jeopardy. 3 weeks after his return, Alexander awoke from a vivid dream with complete clarity about the solution. The design appeared in his mind with unprecedented simplicity, and elegance, a configuration they had never considered, because it defied several conventional engineering assumptions. He sketched it immediately, and when he presented it to his team the following day, even the most skeptical engineers recognized its brilliance. "The solution came to me fully formed," Alexander explained when asked about his sudden insight, "not through incremental steps of reasoning, but as a complete understanding, exactly the way information presented itself. During my near-death experience, when implemented, the design worked perfectly, resolving problems that had stymied their best efforts for years." Alexander understood then that his experience had given him access to a different mode of cognition, a way of thinking that transcended ordinary analytical processes and connected with something beyond physical limitation. The final understanding. As months passed, Alexander's perspective continued to evolve. The existential fear that had subtly colored his entire life, fear of death, of meaninglessness, of final dissolution, had been replaced by a profound recognition that consciousness transcends physical form. If everything Alexander had experienced was true, if consciousness indeed continues beyond bodily death, if thought possesses creative power beyond our ordinary understanding, if love and knowledge exist independent of physical structures, then the implications extended far beyond his personal transformation. They demanded a complete reconsideration of human existence itself. Why we spend years accumulating fears, nursing grievances, chasing shallow goals. He reflected during a lecture at Cambridge University. We dread aging, illness, financial insecurity, loss of relationship, but most tragically, we fear looking inward, acknowledging that life might be infinitely deeper than our habitual patterns and obligations suggest. Alexander no longer feared death. Instead, he feared only one thing, living the remainder of his life without understanding its purpose. Having glimpsed a more expansive reality, he couldn't bear the thought of returning to unconscious patterns of existence, of sleepwalking through the precious time remaining in physical form. The transformed perspective. In the year following his near-death experience, friends and colleagues noticed profound changes in Alexander's demeanor and priorities. The driven, sometimes impatient academic who had regularly worked 16-hour days became more measured, more present. He still conducted research, still published papers, but with a noticeably different attitude toward both success and failure. "Alexander seems like he's operating on a completely different timescale now," remarked Dr. Julian Mercer, his longtime research partner. "Problems that would have frustrated him for weeks now barely register. It's as though he's seeing everything from a higher vantage point." Perhaps most startling was Alexander's newfound ability to connect with others. Previously reserved and sometimes awkward in social situations, he developed a remarkable capacity for empathy and attentive listening. People who had known him for decades were stunned by his transformation from brilliant but distant intellectual to deeply compassionate presence. "It's not that I suddenly became a different person," Alexander explained when Alina commented on these changes. "Rather, the experience showed me who I've always been beneath the conditioned patterns of thinking and behaving. We're all much more than we appear to be, infinite consciousness temporarily expressing through finite form." The question that changes everything. Alexander's experience presented a fundamental challenge not just to his own worldview but to anyone who encountered his story. If consciousness continues beyond physical death, how might that knowledge transform how we live before that transition? The recognition that death is not our end doesn't diminish the importance of this life. Alexander often emphasized during his increasingly well-attended lectures. Rather, it infuses every moment with greater significance. If our choices, relationships, and development of consciousness continue to matter beyond physical existence, then how we live day by day carries eternal consequence. This perspective led Alexander to reconsider how he invested his remaining time and energy. He continued his scientific work, but also devoted substantial time to exploring consciousness itself, not merely as a neurological phenomenon, but as the fundamental ground of all reality. He practiced meditation, studied various wisdom traditions, and engaged with other researchers investigating non-local consciousness and quantum models of mind. Most significantly, Alexander began living with a heightened awareness of life's inherent preciousness. Small moments, a conversation with his sister, the play of light through autumn leaves, the complex harmonies of Bach's cello suites, took on a luminous quality previously unnoticed amid his driven pursuit of intellectual achievement. The beginning, not the end. Alexander's story concludes not with answers, but with an invitation, a call to examine how we might live differently if we recognize death as transition rather than termination. His experience suggests that our consciousness continues its journey beyond physical form, but also that how we develop that consciousness during embodied existence profoundly matters. Even those who maintain skepticism about near-death experiences might consider the practical wisdom embedded in Alexander's transformation, the recognition that life's brevity makes each moment precious, that relationships matter more than achievements, that inner development outweighs external acquisition, and that being fully present to our experience might be the greatest human opportunity. 8 minutes beyond the threshold of death, taught Alexander Petrov. What decades of brilliant scientific work could not that? Consciousness is the fundamental reality from which all else emerges, that love is a cosmic force rather than merely a human emotion, and that death is not the end of our journey, but perhaps its true beginning. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of Alexander's testimony isn't the extraordinary realm he visited during clinical death, but how that brief experience forever transformed his approach to living. He no longer postponed joy, authentic expression, or meaningful connection. He no longer treated life as an indefinite resource to be consumed casually. Instead, he embraced each moment with the awareness that it offered an unrepeatable opportunity to experience, to connect, to evolve. What might change in your own life if you knew with certainty that death is not the end but a threshold? What priorities would shift? What fears would dissolve? What would you no longer postpone? Perhaps the most important question isn't what happens after death, but how that knowledge might transform how you live today, this hour, this very moment.